it was. Well, my friends, I say this to you. Yes, things might have been worse. But on the other hand, remember that things might have been a whole lot better.
Nation is in difficulty. Not permanent difficulty. Temporary. Surely temporary.
Wir haben nun in Paris und London und New York
On the 30th of January 1933, Adolf Hitler took office as Chancellor of Germany. Shortly after taking office, at a gigantic rally masterminded by his new propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, he promised the German people to eliminate the crippling depression that had inflicted poverty and misery on an unprecedented scale. It wasn't just the militant nationalists and monarchists that rallied behind the Nazi banner. Millions of ordinary Germans rapturously applauded this promise to return the country to prosperity. 6 million Germans were out of work. Living standards had collapsed. Business was almost at a standstill, and thousands were living on the brink of starvation. Hysteria whipped up by Hitler blamed Germany's ruin on a conspiracy between the country's foreign enemies and traitors at home. The pitiful state of the German nation in January 1933 was all the worse because of the sharp contrast with the prosperity of only 4 years before. In 1929, the standard of living for most Germans was higher than that of any other continental country. Berlin was a rich, bustling and cultured city, a mecca for artists and businessmen alike. Germany was once again the most powerful industrial nation in Europe. A massive program of industrial rationalization in the 20s had led to the emergence of such giants as Siemens and AEG in the electrical industry, Krupp in engineering, and Opel in the motor industry. And the products of these companies were outselling those of Britain and the United States in most markets in the world. These Berliners were not only enjoying their newfound prosperity in 1929, they also seemed to be living in a country that had finally achieved political stability. And Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist Party were agitating without much impact on the fringe of German politics. The Weimar Republic, the constitutional democracy which had replaced the monarchy after the First World War, had been on the verge of collapse throughout the early 20s. But the parliamentary elections of 1928 seemed finally to have resolved the conflict over the legitimacy of the Weimar state. Over 2/3 of the German voters backed the moderate democratic politicians who tried to make the republic work. The elections brought to power politicians like the veteran foreign minister, Gustav Stresemann, who were dedicated to improving relations between Germany and the countries which had defeated her in the war. In 1929, Germany had been a country that seemed to have come to terms with its neighbors and with its past. Yet 4 years later, it had 6 million unemployed and was united behind Hitler's fanatical, menacing Nazi party. No doubt the Great War and the Russian Revolution were the great events that shaped our world. But in purely economic terms, the Great Depression was the most momentous episode in the history of our century. In America, it put a question mark over the whole future of capitalism. In Britain, the economic chaos led political leaders to abandon the two-party system in favor of a coalition government. But here in Germany, it propelled into office a man whose expansionist, racist, and imperialist policies unleashed the terror and the devastation of the Second World War. Why did the Great Depression destroy democracy in Germany? What mysterious forces gripped the minds of the people who gave Hitler such a rapturous reception here in Nuremberg in 1933? Part of the answer lies in the uniquely sudden and brutal impact of the Depression on Germany in 1929. In that year, the Germans were just beginning to taste affluence. No other country suffered so much, so suddenly. And the reason for that is to be found in the peace treaty signed at Versailles in June 1919 and in the events that followed. When the Allies assembled after the Great War to agree on the peace terms they'd demand from Germany, they were determined, in the now famous words of one British cabinet minister, to squeeze Germany like a lemon until the pips squeaked. The British Prime Minister, Lloyd George, re-elected after the war on the popular slogan, "Hang the Kaiser," bowed to his countrymen's wish for revenge. The French, having lost an entire generation of 1.5 million young men, insisted on making Germany pay to the last penny. The terms which the Allies dictated were harsh, and the Weimar politicians who signed for Germany were forced to agree to numerous political concessions. But from an economic point of view, the most important outcome of Versailles was the financial penalty imposed on Germany to make her pay for all the loss and damage the war had caused to the Allies and to their peoples. Germany was made to pay the French and Belgians in kind first: rolling stock, machine tools, farm machinery, and even a couple of 100,000 farm animals. Much more important, however, was the enormous sum of money Germany agreed to pay: £6.5 billion to be paid over the next 30 years. During 1921 and 1922, the Weimar government obeyed the terms of the treaty, and the monthly payments of reparations threw the budget into deficit. The government, however, was afraid of trying to balance its budget by passing on the reparations burden directly to the German people in the form of direct taxes. Instead, the government decided to finance it by printing money. As a result, the rate of inflation accelerated. In January 1923, it spiraled into an uncontrollable hyperinflation. Fritz Neumark was an official in the German finance ministry at the time.
At the end of the war, the purchasing power of the mark was about 1/10 of what it had been before the war. And the same was true in the field of foreign exchange. I mean, if you take the dollar, let's say, as a measure, as the standard. But then, until 22 or so, several governments tried to have a certain reduction of the rate of inflation, and from time to time, for 2 or 3 months, they were successful. But then we had the event which, according to me, made or caused the inflation to degenerate into what is called hyperinflation. And that was really during the last the first 6 months or 7 months of the year 1923. Because then the government paid workers for not working in the Ruhr after the occupation of the Ruhr, coal mines and so on, and the big industrial plants by the French troops.
The French and Belgian troops moved into the Ruhr after a report that Germany had broken its treaty obligations by failing to deliver on time a consignment of, above all things, 140,000 telegraph poles. With only a token army at its command, the Weimar government was powerless to resist the invasion. Instead, it called on workers and government officials in the Ruhr to follow a policy of passive resistance. With everyone on strike, government tax receipts fell sharply, and the government simply speeded up the printing presses to keep going. As inflation soared, the value of the German currency, the mark, collapsed. The severity of the inflation is best measured by comparing its exchange rate with the American dollar. In June 1922, the exchange rate was 330 marks to the dollar. By the next May, it was 73,000. People were getting used to handling billions of marks. As the value of the mark plummeted, the government commandeered printing presses and kept them working around the clock. Eventually, the central bank realized that it couldn't print the marks fast enough, as one of its employees, Karl Richter, explained.
Ich habe nicht die, also während der Inflationszeit war es so, dass die Reichsdruckerei das Geld alleine nicht drucken konnte, sondern dass praktisch viele Druckereien in ganz Deutschland damals Geld gedruckt haben. Und wenn zum Beispiel der Lohn 1920 noch bei 86 Mark lag, dann war es so, dass am Ende der Inflationszeit der einzelne Buchdrucker 3,5 Billionen Mark verdient hat. Und das Geld reichte gerade dazu, dass er musste versuchen, so schnell wie möglich, das war ja ein ganzer Waschkorb voll, versuchen, sofort Lebensmittel zu kaufen, weil sonst das Geld schon wieder veraltet war. Ja, und dann war es ja so, da ja die Geldscheine sehr schnell veralteten, dann blieb den Druckereien gar nichts weiter übrig, als wie immer eine neue Summe raufzudrucken. Also auf einen 1000-Mark-Schein wurde aufgedruckt 1 Milliarde Mark.
Germany was now suffering the worst inflation in recorded history. Everyday life was transformed as people desperately unloaded their marks before they became worthless. Workers demanded to be paid twice a day, and they spent their earnings at once. Restaurants would only serve their customers if they agreed to pay at the rate which prevailed at the end of the meal. Meta Karsch, a social worker in Berlin at the time.
Das Gehalt stieg von Tag zu Tag bis nachher zum Schluss in die Billionen hinein. Wir hatten keine Möglichkeit, einkaufen zu gehen an den Bäckerläden und überhaupt die Lebensmittelläden, nicht wahr? Die waren mit Schlangen besetzt. Jeder versuchte noch irgendetwas zu bekommen, um bloß nicht zu verhungern. Da ja die Lebensmittel bei uns in der ganzen Zeit schon sehr verknappt waren, also auch Leute keine Möglichkeit hatten, sich Vorrat zu schaffen, versuchten sie jetzt doch das Letzte, was in den Läden war, zusammenzuholen. Es musste die Polizei aufgeboten werden, die dann, um Plünderung zu vermeiden, antrat und um das alles einigermaßen in die Wege zu bekommen.
The inflation wiped out the value of saving. The moneyed middle classes were bankrupted. That was to have ominous social and political consequences.
Well, the middle class, so to speak, was expropriated by inflation, and that was a consequence of a certain theory defended by the courts, namely mark equals mark. They wouldn't recognize that the mark of 1914 was something quite different from the mark of 23 or so. But the people knew who lost their savings who lost their occupations, and so on and so on. And that is why I think the middle class and the older people who had become expropriated by the effects of inflation would be more or less favorable to Hitler, particularly so since they didn't understand what he was promising in the field of economics.
The great inflation of 1923 was eventually brought to an end by a new German government in the following year. It brought in a new mark, worth 1,000 billion of the old inflated mark. The inflation had two important results. It persuaded the Allies that the reparations burden imposed at Versailles was too great, and so they agreed to scale down the reparations payments, which were to be handed over for 30 years. And once the German government agreed to abide by the new reparations schedule, the Allies provided a loan to enable her to meet the payments. Both sides, the Allies and the Germans, were happy with the new arrangement, which opened the way for a new era in the life of the Weimar Republic. Once the Allies, and especially the United States government, were convinced that Germany was politically stable and would honor its debts, it gave the green light to American investors, who were attracted by the high interest rates available in Germany. The Reichsbank kept interest rates higher than those available elsewhere in Europe or America, because it needed the foreign loans to pay for reparations. Between 1924 and 1929, American and other foreign investors happily poured over 23 billion marks into Germany. Industrialists took advantage of these overseas loans to modernize and rationalize their businesses, equipping their factories and plants with the most up-to-date technology available from the booming United States. These foreign loans financed the German industrial boom of the late 1920s and enabled Germany to capture so many lucrative export markets around the world. The Weimar politicians were just as eager as the industrialists to spend the foreigners' money. The German railway network was modernized at enormous cost. And the country's roads were also improved. The Social Democrats threw their weight behind a massive housing program, providing cheap, modern flats for the workers. And the government boosted its spending on welfare as well, building hospitals and raising pensions for the old and the sick. It wasn't just the central government that was spending money. State and local government, too, were investing in housing and other public buildings. In investing this borrowed money, the Germans were sowing the seeds of their future destruction because they were violating a fundamental law of banking. They were borrowing the money short-term from abroad and investing it long-term in industrial machinery, buildings, and other physical assets which couldn't easily be sold for cash if and when the lenders recalled their loans. A further reason why Germany was in a dangerous economic position in 1929 was that of the 23 billion marks borrowed since 1924, over 8 billion had been recycled to pay the Allies. So if the foreign banks recalled this money, clearly Germany couldn't pay it back. Germany's prosperity then was so vulnerable in 1929 because it was built on money borrowed from abroad, and much of that could have been withdrawn at any moment. And the reason why Germany borrowed the money can be traced back to the peace settlement in 1919. The Weimar government had no need to worry about that, just so long as foreign investors continued to pour in more money than was flowing out in reparations or to pay for imports. But in the second half of 1928 and the early months of 1929, things began to go wrong. Now foreigners, and especially the Americans, had found a more attractive home for their money than here in Germany. They decided to put it on Wall Street, more precisely, in the New York stock market, which was rising like a lift. Not even high German interest rates could hope to compete with the euphoria and the rising share prices of Wall Street in early 1929. It was this fall-off in American loans to Germany which set off the crisis in the economy. As the flow of foreign loans into Germany ebbed away in the autumn of 1929, interest rates began to rise. The high cost of borrowing then caused a downturn in the level of economic activity. High interest charges make it more difficult for businessmen to make profits on their investments. So German industrialists cut back on their investment programs. That caused a sharp increase in the level of unemployment. All of this happened even before the Wall Street crash in the autumn of 1929. After the crash, business confidence in Germany took another dive, and this too caused even further retrenchment in the economy. The number out of work rose rapidly in late 1929. It climbed from 1.5 million at the beginning of the year to nearly 3 million by the end. This rise in unemployment, in turn, produced a further fall in demand, which led to even more unemployment. In January 1930, almost 1 million more workers registered for unemployment than the month before. By February, over 3.5 million were unemployed. It was this high unemployment that became, in March 1930, the issue which threw the Weimar coalition government of Chancellor Müller into a political crisis. The huge rise in the number out of work threw the unemployment fund, approved by the Reichstag, German parliament, deeply into the red. The two main coalition partners disagreed over what to do. The majority Social Democratic Party, backed by the trade unions, wanted the size of the fund increased to give more help to the unemployed. When the People's Party, representing big business, refused to agree, the Grand Coalition broke apart in March 1930. The outbreak of the Great Depression then exposed a basic flaw in the economy, built into the Weimar Republic at Versailles in 1919. It was in this opulent hall of mirrors, where the French themselves had surrendered to Germany after the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, that they now had their revenge. The prosperity of Germany in the late 1920s had depended on the willingness of the Allies to keep lending to Germany. When the Allies failed to come to the rescue in the early months of the Depression, the economic crisis turned into a political crisis as well and destroyed the coalition led by the Social Democrats. Within 3 years, as the Depression deepened, this political crisis grew steadily worse, until in the end, German democracy itself was destroyed. The political consequences of the Depression in Germany were so catastrophic because the Weimar state, like the Weimar economy, had an inherent weakness, and that too can be traced back here to Versailles. The treaty stripped Germany of all her overseas colonies. Large areas of German territory were ceded to Poland and Czechoslovakia. Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France. And to satisfy the French desire for security, the German Rhineland was occupied by Allied troops. Germany would never again pose a threat to Europe, for the treaty prohibited the German government from having an air force or a navy, and from building up its army beyond what was required to keep order at home. The nationalists had kept up a barrage of anti-republican, jingoistic rhetoric against the politicians who had signed the armistice in 1918. The truth was that Germany was defeated in the Great War, but the Allied decision not to invade Germany after her defeat gave the nationalists an opportunity to propagate the myth that the Kaiser and the Army High Command had been stabbed in the back by the Social Democratic politicians. This stab-in-the-back legend persisted throughout the 1920s and enabled the nationalists to denounce the hated Weimar Republic as a treasonable regime imposed on Germany by her enemies abroad and by traitors at home. The hatred spilled over onto the streets. Having betrayed one generation of Germans by signing the armistice, the Social Democrats, in nationalist eyes, had, by agreeing to reparations, enslaved future generations as well. The Weimar state, then, faced a challenge to its legitimacy from the moment of its birth. In the early years of the 1920s, a sizable section of the German population was hostile to the Republic, and the extremists frequently resorted to violence. Several leading Weimar politicians were assassinated during these years, including Matthias Erzberger, who'd signed the armistice for Germany, and Walter Rathenau, the foreign minister who'd agreed to pay reparations. Apart from assassinations, the Weimar politicians had to struggle to survive against repeated attempts at coup d'etat and armed insurrection by implacable nationalists. One such putsch in Munich in 1923 ended in failure and a 5-year jail sentence for its relatively unknown leader, Adolf Hitler. The number of Germans who owed no allegiance to the Weimar Republic increased sharply during 1923 and 1924. These were the years of the great inflation. As the inflation wiped out the value of savings, it drove the bankrupted middle classes into the nationalist camp. Resentment of the new order established after the war was widespread. The army's high command grudgingly accepted that it must cooperate with the new republic, but in its heart it despised the new order. The civil service, too, had been largely inherited from the days of the monarchy and had not been educated to accept the new democracy. The large landowners, especially the big estate holders in eastern Germany, had little love for Weimar governments because their interests were threatened. Before the war, German agriculture was protected from cheap imports by tariffs, which benefited the landowners and the peasantry at the expense of the workers in the cities, who were forced to pay high food prices. But in the 1920s, German food prices fell sharply, reducing the incomes and the profits of the landed gentry and the small farmers alike. Small businessmen and the owners of family concerns were another class whose interests were threatened by the Republic. Under the social democratic laws, trade unions were given greater bargaining power, which forced up wages. Taxation to pay for the progressive welfare provisions and public spending on housing all hit the business class. The industrial rationalization policy, which sponsored the giant combines, drove many small firms out of business. As a result, middle-class resentment of the Republic was kept alive. All the traditionally conservative groups in Germany, the big landowners, the peasants, the army officers, the civil service and the shopkeepers, were prepared to put up with the Republic as long as the good times lasted. But when the good times came to an end, they and millions of other Germans succumbed to the seduction of Hitler's promise that the Nazis would bring the good times back. The treaty, then, signed here at Versailles, was the major reason for the disastrous consequences which the Great Depression was to have in Germany. It was the root cause of both the economic vulnerability of Germany and the political fragility of the Weimar Republic. It would be a great exaggeration, though, to argue that the Weimar Republic was doomed from the start. On the contrary, as we've seen, it provided the great majority of Germans with considerable prosperity by 1929. For most Germans, Hitler, the Nazis, and the extreme nationalists were a crankish, almost comic diversion during the boom years of the 1920s. If the prosperity had continued, it's fair to assume that they'd have withered away. In time, the Weimar state would have won the allegiance of the great majority of its citizens. But Weimar ran out of time. When the Great Depression brought prosperity to an end and threw the economy into disarray, the Nazis were able to move to the center of the political stage as the Grand Coalition broke up in arguments over whether and how to cut unemployment benefits. The Nazis were able to point to the huge reparations payments being handed over to the Allies. Now, the Treaty of Versailles proved to be a colossal blunder by the Allies, for it enabled the Nazis to argue persuasively that it was Germany's foreign enemies and the Weimar politicians who had caused the depression. In the spring of 1930, however, when the Grand Coalition resigned, the Allies could still have stopped Hitler. If they were prepared to forget about reparations and bail out the German economy, the Nazi threat to the Weimar Republic would rapidly disappear. That was what the next Chancellor of Weimar Germany devoutly believed. No individual could be a better symbol of the latent weakness of the Weimar Republic in 1929 than the man who'd been its president since 1925, Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg. He'd been the defeated commander of the armed forces in 1918, and he was in fact the author of the subsequent legend that it was the Weimar politicians who had betrayed Germany by stabbing the army in the back and by signing the armistice. After the political turmoil of the Republic's early years, he reluctantly allowed the nationalists and the Nazis to draft him as their presidential candidate in 1925. When he scraped home the winner, the Liberals and the Social Democrats were afraid that he'd undermine their new constitutional democracy. Though there's no doubt of his preference for the monarchy, he had, until 1929, honored his oath to uphold the Constitution. As the economic crisis deepened into 1930, however, the 84-year-old Hindenburg fell more and more under the sway of the high-ranking anti-republican army officers in his presidential entourage. They encouraged him to dispense with ineffective parliamentary government and to find a strong man to end the crisis. Hindenburg accepted the advice and picked out an ex-army officer with impeccable wartime credentials, a man of orthodox economic views, and the leader of the Catholic Centre Party, Heinrich Brüning. The president, exploiting the emergency powers in the Constitution which enabled him to rule by decree without the need for a parliamentary majority, told Brüning to do what was necessary to restore the economy to health. Brüning's strategy for curing the depression in Germany was in effect deliberately to make it worse. His first objective was to persuade the Allies that Germany could never afford to pay the reparations they demanded. Brüning was convinced that once he succeeded in sufficiently impoverishing the German people, the Allies would see the injustice and the futility of their demands, and they'd agree to cancel all reparations debts. As soon as reparations were ended, Brüning would emerge as a nationalist hero, the man who freed Germany from the burdens imposed at Versailles. The Nazis would pose no threat to Brüning after that. With foreign money flowing out of Germany at an alarming rate, Brüning announced, a few days after becoming Chancellor, that he'd embark on a savage austerity program. Public expenditure of all kinds was to be drastically reduced, including unemployment benefits. The wages and salaries of civil servants would also be cut. Central and local government taxes were to be raised in an effort to balance the government's budget. When the Reichstag refused to endorse his economic policies, Brüning dissolved it and called elections for September 1930. He pressed ahead with the disputed policies. Predictably, they drove the economy deeper into depression. The plight of the poor in the cities, where many people were almost starving, was made even worse by Brüning's decision sharply to increase the price of food, to levy a relief fund for agriculture in eastern Germany. Up until this time, people had to queue in the streets for food. Now, unable to afford the high prices, many were reduced to begging or to rooting in dustbins for scraps. This policy outraged many people and lent force to the Nazi arguments. The levy was paid to the large landowners, already one of the most prosperous and influential groups in the country. The election in the autumn of 1930 provided a foretaste of what lay in store for German society. There was open violence, with armed clashes between communists and Nazis in Berlin and other cities. The voters deserted the moderate center parties in the election in favor of the communists on the one side and the Nazis on the other. The gains for the extreme left and the extreme right showed that over 30% of the electorate now owed no loyalty to the Weimar state. The Nazis scored a spectacular victory in the election, increasing their representation in the Reichstag tenfold. When the 100 or so new Nazi representatives entered the Reichstag after the election, they provoked an ugly anti-Semitic riot which spilled over into street battles. This started the alarm bells ringing for foreign investors, whose withdrawals soon reached panic levels. Germany had now entered a downward spiral into total political chaos. For as the loans were pulled out, the government deflated the economy even more, the Nazis grew stronger and the foreigners ever more alarmed. Yet in spite of the growing Nazi menace to his government, Brüning persevered with his strategy. Dismayed at the continuing budget deficit, he embarked after the election on a further savage round of public spending cuts and tax increases, and he combined this with a plea to the Allies to recognize that Germany could no longer afford to pay such huge reparations. Brüning's pleas fell on deaf ears, but by the end of 1930, the Allies themselves were facing severe economic problems. Albert Speer, later one of Hitler's wartime cabinet.
It would have been already sufficient if they would have stopped the reparations, and if they would have, but I think it would have been much more effective if they would have changed also some points of the Versailles Treaty. For instance, one of the points which were supporting Hitler was that in the Versailles Treaty was a paragraph that everybody in the German people is responsible for the outbreak of the war. In 1914, I was 9 years old, but this was still hanging over me, that I am responsible for this thing which happened in history. And Hitler, of course, he was, in his arguments, he was playing out such things very heavily, and one was impressed by it. And he says, I will stop this nonsense when I am in power.
As the economy sank deeper into depression, Brüning persisted with his strategy of trying to persuade the Allies to let Germany off the hook of reparations. By that time, he'd inflicted poverty and misery on the German people on an appalling scale. But he was convinced that, in the end, the Allies would see things his way. It was a dangerous game. Throughout Brüning's months in office, the Nazis thrived as never before. Hitler roamed the country, blaming Germany's enemies abroad for the depression and denouncing Brüning as an appeaser. The Nazi soup kitchens, which toured the streets in the working-class neighborhoods of Berlin, spoke to the hunger in the bellies of thousands of Germans. But the Nazi promise to restore German pride and prosperity spoke to the emotions of millions. Brüning's already weak position was further enfeebled in May 1931, when Germany was engulfed in a European banking crisis. The panic, as it happened, began in Vienna, where the Kreditanstalt Bank admitted that it was bankrupt. Foreigners clamored to pull their money out of Austria, and the Austrian Central Bank was forced to freeze all foreign debts. Unfortunately for Chancellor Brüning, German money invested in Austria was frozen too. Foreigners who'd invested in Germany now grew alarmed that their loans to German banks would be frozen as well, so they raced to pull out their funds. The Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, tried to shore up the banks at a cost of half of its reserves, but eventually it proved unable to cope. Anxious crowds formed outside banks in the hope of getting their money out. The Reichsbank's freedom of action was narrowly restricted by legislation enacted after the hyperinflation of 1923. The law required the Reichsbank to hold 40% of the value of its currency in gold, so it was unable to print paper money in violation of these reserve requirements. Instead, it had to tell the government to try to raise the necessary money abroad. The German banking crisis came to a head in July 1931, when the Danat, one of the country's biggest banks, admitted that it was bankrupt. Brüning asked the Allies to bail Germany out. Britain declined because she didn't have the money to lend. The Americans refused because President Hoover was trying desperately to balance his budget. Only the French were able and willing to negotiate a loan to Germany. But the French insisted that Germany must agree to strict political conditions. Among other things, they wanted Brüning to suppress the Nazis. Brüning went back to Berlin to chew over the French terms. All around him, the nationalists and the Nazis were agitating and campaigning for Hitler. With street fighting in Berlin and violent Nazi disorders all over Germany, Brüning realized that capitulation to the French terms would have provoked a civil war. He refused the loan and closed down all the banks and foreign exchange markets. 2 months of recurrent bank panics and repeated currency crises left business demoralized, and Germany sunk deeper into depression. Unemployment now reached almost 6 million. 1 worker in every 2.
...1929 war das. Und 1930 waren die Banken bereits geplatzt. Es war der ganze Verkehr stockte, die Geschäfte hatten zum Teil geschlossen, Firmen hatten geschlossen, alles ging durcheinander und alles nicht wahr. Und wir als Fürsorgerin, ich war inzwischen Fürsorgerin geworden, wir als Fürsorgerin gingen nun in die Familien, um zu sehen, was noch irgendwie zu helfen ist. Und da ist mir ein Fall auch ganz besonders in Erinnerung. Das waren Millionäre. Ein alter Mann und eine alte Frau. Die saßen in einem Zimmer von der großen Wohnung. Das Zimmer war schon vollständig leer, alles war verkauft worden, was noch nied- und nagelfest waren. Auf ihren Koffern 2 Koffer und sie waren auch nicht fähig, sich selbst anzuziehen, mal erklärten sie mir. Und sie hatten immer ihren Butler und waren so verwöhnt und nun war es aus. Nicht? Sie fingen dann an zu weinen und so weiter nicht. Und ich habe dann diese beiden Menschen in ein Heim, in ein gutes, verhältnismäßig gutes Heim unterbringen können. Und man hat dann sie dort behalten und ich glaube, sie sind dann auch dort gestorben.
Having plunged the German economy into chaos, the European banking crisis next spread to London. In 2 months, it had swept the British government from power and forced Britain off the gold standard. The British and German banking crises illustrated a fundamental weakness of the international financial system. No nation in Europe was strong enough to stand alone against the forces of financial panic. There was only one country with a monetary muscle to bail out any country that might be in trouble, and that was the United States. But President Hoover, not understanding how the economies of the industrial countries depended on each other, refused to help. This isolationism rebounded on America, and incidentally on Herbert Hoover himself before long. After the British financial crisis of 1931, the mighty dollar itself came under attack. The steps that were taken to defend it only made the American depression even worse. There was a point where the United States could have rescued Germany. But after the banking collapse of 1931, the country was consumed by political turmoil. Soon, it would be too late to stop the Nazis. Adolf Hitler seized that opportunity. Early in 1932, Hitler made a decisive breakthrough in his campaign for power when he addressed the country's business leaders at the Düsseldorf Industrial Club. In a speech lasting 2.5 hours, he mesmerized his audience, promising to tear up the Treaty of Versailles, to fight Germany's enemies, and to provide the strong leadership necessary to cure the depression. When he reassured the business leaders that he would not only restore prosperity, but respect private property, they swung their support behind him and lobbied President Hindenburg to make Hitler Chancellor.
Hitler could show the face which he wanted to show to convince a special audience. For instance, he had, about the same time, he had this famous speech to the industrialists in Düsseldorf, in the Ruhr Club. And there too, as I heard afterwards, he was not this man shouting and with his voice almost no more under control. He was trying to convince them in a way, in an almost normal way. But the audience was, after 1 hour, starting to get very much under his influence, and was now themselves, they were shouting and were hailing Hitler and so. But he, strangely enough, he didn't answer it. He continued with what he had in his mind. He was continuing just in a lecturing way.
Hitler had a genius for matching his style to his audience. While in Düsseldorf he assuaged the fears of Germany's business leaders with a quiet, low-key academic delivery, he captivated a mass meeting of workers at the Siemens factory in Berlin with impassioned, emotional oratory.
Nicht die intellektuellen Schichten haben mir den Mut gegeben, dieses gigantische Werk zu beginnen, sondern das kann ich sagen, den Mut habe ich nur gefasst, weil ich zwei Schichten kannte, den Bauer und den deutschen Arbeiter. Die und heute kann ich nur eines sagen. Wir haben in diesen 9 Monaten uns nur mit unserem Volk beschäftigt, haben nur unsere Aufgaben studiert, wollten nur unsere Aufgaben lösen. Und ich bin der Meinung, die anderen Staatsmänner täten gut, wenn sie auch ihre eigenen Aufgaben lösen wollten. Ich erklärte, das deutsche Volk hat nur einen Wunsch, nach seiner Person selig werden zu können. Sie sollen uns in Ruhe lassen.
Brüning's manifest failure to have the Allies cancel reparations or to contain the growing Nazi menace led President Hindenburg to sack him in May 1932. But the aristocratic Hindenburg, contemptuous of the low-born Nazi leader, refused to let Hitler get his hands on the reins of power. Instead, he appointed 2 stopgap puppet chancellors during 1932. For 6 months, Hindenburg tried to entice Hitler into a coalition government. But Hitler, confident that his moment would come, watched his power grow until the president finally yielded to the pressure of events. Hitler took over as chancellor in January 1933.
Tausendfältig bewiesen. Und in der Zeit vor uns kann es nicht anders sein und es wird auch nicht anders sein. Und so grüße ich euch denn als einen alten, treuen, Engländer, wie ich bin.
Within only 3 years of taking office, Adolf Hitler alone, among the leaders of the major industrial powers, had accomplished an extraordinary achievement. He had cured the depression in Germany. By 1936, Germany's national income had got back to the level of 1928, when the country's prosperity had been at its height. So great was the economic recovery that by 1936, some industries were even reporting a shortage of labor. The price Germany paid for Hitler's economic miracle was high. It was, of course, nothing less than democracy. The Nazi regime brought many cruelties. It also meant absolute control over every aspect of the German economy. Hitler, by all accounts, had a refined contempt for economists and their theories. He preferred to attack economic problems directly, by force if necessary. Like a previous German Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, Hitler believed that the great questions of the century would be solved by blood and iron. Hitler began with the question that had plagued previous chancellors, the vulnerability of the economy to withdrawals of foreign money. He rapidly isolated the German economy from the rest of the world. He simply closed the foreign exchanges and strictly controlled all trade with other countries. Where Brüning had lived in terror of the foreign bankers, Hitler simply froze their loans. The Allies protested, but by 1933 they were so immersed in their own depressions that there was little they could do to get their money back. So Hitler was free to tackle the other economic worry that had bedeviled the Weimar politicians. The fact that any effort to spend their way out of the depression would bring back the hyperinflation. For a dictator, inflation was no great problem. Hitler ordered prices to be fixed and dividends to be restricted. The pressure for wage increases disappeared when, on May Day 1933, Hitler eliminated all trade unions and arrested or harassed their members. Karl Richter was a trade union official in Berlin at the time.
ja, die Nationalsozialistische Partei und die Arbeitsfront, das war ja dann die neue Gewerkschaftsbewegung, die fungierte unter diesem Namen. Es wurde am 1. Mai noch eine große Mai-Demonstration durchgeführt und am 2. Mai hat dann die SA die Gewerkschaftshäuser besetzt und die Häuser zum Teil verschandelt, das Mobiliar wurde demoliert, unsere Kollegen, Gewerkschaftsfunktionäre, die wurden misshandelt, zum Teil gefoltert, kamen in die Konzentrationslager.
With private investment under strict control, and with wages, prices and dividends all fixed, Hitler embarked on a massive public spending spree, financed by government deficits, but with no risk of inflation.
Unseren Fleiß, unsere Fähigkeit.
In his first 2 years in power, Hitler's emphasis was on road building and autobahns. He boosted state spending on roads tenfold, so that it accounted for 2/3 of all public spending. Car production doubled each year as a result of Hitler's direction of investment into the motor industry. Roads and car production provided around 1 million jobs during Hitler's first 2 years in power. Once these public spending programs were in full swing, they created a boom in other industries, such as synthetic fuels, tires, and domestic construction. As these industries prospered more and more, workers were taken on, purchasing power rose, and a climate of confidence inspired Germany's business leaders to invest. Yet in the last analysis, what made Hitler's economic miracle work was terror.
Die ersten Verhaftungen gingen ja dann schon gleich im Anfang, nach dieser Wahl, gleich im Anfang los. Am 31. Januar war der große Zapfenstreich da mit Fackelzug und mit allem und begeistert zogen die Menschen da mit. Also ich war nicht da, aber auf den Straßen war alles voll und so weiter, nicht wahr? Und alles schrie schon Heil Hitler. Mein Mann ist dann in einem Lokal, ich war nicht dabei, und da muss er irgendwie sich geäußert haben und er muss denunziert worden sein, und es war an und für sich und ich weiß nur nicht, wie das passiert ist. Jedenfalls bekam ich nur eine Karte, ich sollte in die Heil- und Pflegeanstalt nach Wittenau kommen, und am nächsten Tag war da Sprechstunde, ich ging sofort hin und fand meinen Mann sehr elend, die Lippen waren sehr blau, er raffte sich aber auf, ging mit mir in den Garten und hinter uns her kam ein Pfleger und der sagte zu mir, nehmen Sie doch bloß Ihren Mann mit nach Hause, der gehört hier doch nicht her. Und nun muss ich sagen, ich habe das nicht begriffen, weil ich weiß es bis heute nicht, aber das ist das schlimmste Erlebnis für mich bis heute. Er sagte auch, ich schaffe das nicht und fahre nach Hause. Und am nächsten Tag bekam ich dann die Nachricht, er sei nachmittags um 5 Uhr verstorben. Entschuldigung.
The Great Depression had a savage, devastating impact on Germany and on its people. Its effects were even more painful and more widespread here than they were elsewhere. It's true that after 1933 the German economy recovered more rapidly than any other. The tragedy is that it was then already too late. Economic collapse had already destroyed parliamentary democracy and brought the Nazis to power. Soon it was to be a tragedy for the whole world, which was engulfed in the war Hitler started. Britain, France, and especially the most powerful of the Allies, the United States, must carry a great share of the burden of responsibility for that tragedy. The desire for vengeance that was satisfied at Versailles in 1919 had from the beginning gravely enfeebled the Weimar state, and the total economic and political collapse of the German Republic led to the Nazi dictatorship. Many legacies from past troubles went into that. German nationalism, Prussian militarism. But the decisive one was the failure of the Allies to rise above their resentments and come to the rescue of the German people and relieve the misery and despair of the Great Depression.
Oder ein bewusster Lügner kann denken, dass ich oder irgendjemand jemals die Absicht hätten, das aufzulösen, was wir selbst in langen Jahren aufgebaut haben. Nein, meine Kameraden, wir stehen fest zusammen für unser Deutschland.